How does one know if a situation with a brand or a business is in a real crisis or merely a bump in the road?
Now, Bill and Melinda Gates' high-profile divorce has taken another turn with new reports the tech giant had an affair with a Microsoft employee.
Yes, it's the latest scandal to come to light following news of weekend retreats with an ex-girlfriend and a connection to Jeffrey Epstein.
Chrissy Teigen now getting a taste of the less cancel culture. Multiple retailers distancing themselves from the former model and pulling her cookware line after several startling accusations of cyberbullying from the past resurfaced.
Colonial Pipeline paying a ransom to the criminal hackers who shut down their systems last week. Now, this source familiar with the situation not telling me how much Colonial Pipeline paid or when that payment specifically was made.
Well, after moving to the United States last year, Prince Harry uses his freedom of speech to bash freedom of speech in the First Amendment.
Welcome to the Confident Communications Podcast, where we help communicators create the right response at the right time and deliver it in the right place. On the podcast this week, what constitutes a crisis? For business owners and communicators, it's not often that you think about what a crisis might do to your business. I do because that's my job. But it is important to be prepared when it happens. When it happens. Because there's always a crisis around the corner. The first step in crisis planning is always to determine the different types of crises, the types that can hurt your business. Now, different crises will necessitate different resources, different stakeholders. But the problem is, how do you plan for something if you don't even know what's going to happen or what is happening in the first place? Now, when I work with clients on crisis planning, I run them through an exercise. I run them through a threat list. I ask them what they perceive to be potential threats to their business. The answers I often receive in this exercise are the logical threats, the obvious types of threats. Rarely do I get the threats that are on the list I'm going to give you today. But these other threats, the not so obvious ones, can hurt your business just the same. A good crisis plan is based on an understanding that there could be a myriad of crises that can impact your organization. So it's imperative that you know how to respond to any crisis in advance. So in this episode, I'm going to cover 10 common types of crises that a brand or business may face. Now, if you're a business owner or a communicator, you work for a business, I know you can add plenty more of crises examples to this list. But these examples will give you a starting point to uncovering the potential vulnerabilities in your business. Because when you know what you're up against, it can give you the confidence that you need to handle anything. Now, before I jump into the list of 10, let me tell you what's not on the list. And this is a crisis that most people define as a crisis. One type of a crisis is an operational crisis. So that's going to be the 10 types that I'm going to explain. But the first type of crisis that happens to a lot of businesses doesn't really fall into that list, and that is a disaster. Some type of a disaster, a natural disaster, it's a crisis that is 100% out of your control. That's why it doesn't fit the definition of a crisis to your business. So these are the natural disasters like wildfires, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, explosions, terrorism, a virus. So it's any event where your business has zero responsibility. Now, let's go on to the 10 types of operational crises that can impact your business. Okay, so the number one type of crisis, the collateral crisis. Now, a collateral crisis is when your business vulnerabilities are exposed due to a crisis not of your doing. For example, a natural disaster that I just mentioned. The natural disaster itself is not a crisis, but if that natural disaster reveals a vulnerability to your company, something that shows that you were not prepared to handle that disaster. For example, The winter storm that plunged large parts of Texas into sub-freezing temperatures and overwhelmed the state's electricity infrastructure. If you remember, it caused massive power outages, not just in Texas, but also rolling blackouts that impacted states even up on the Canadian border. Nearly 4.5 million Texas homes and businesses were without power, and many were without water as well. Collateral fallout example would be a headline like the Electric Reliability Council of Texas officials spent 40 seconds on a winter storm preparedness plan at a February 9th meeting. That's an example of a collateral damage due to this one natural disaster. Another example from the same storm. A senator hops on a plane to Mexico for a family sojourn when his constituents are stuck home without water, power, or heat. That would be Senator Ted Cruz. We also talked about that in the episode. So when you have one disaster, a business or an organization can rise from that disaster and show operational resilience, but they can also be felled by it as well. All right, number 2 example would be rumor. That's when false or misleading information is uncovered by chance or leaked on purpose to harm the brand or an organization. I had crowdsourced this question on Twitter last week, and here were 2 examples that I received. The first example was from someone who shared back in 2015, WestJet Airlines out of Canada. There was a distress call that was tracked on flightradar24.com. So this website tracks all the airline signals. The website claimed that there was a jet, WestJet, that was transmitting a code for hijacking, which happens to be 7500. Now, in the tweet, it said it's not confirmed. It can just be a mistake, but Twitter was off and running. So there was a story that this WestJet airline was hijacked. Darren Hales, he's the one who replied to me on Twitter, and he stated that he had just started at that job, that the crisis unfolded on a Saturday night. And that was one of the first things he had to deal with. And he could not get a hold of anyone on the comms team. Oh my gosh, can you imagine? But he also added that they did take control of the narrative as soon as they realized what was happening. They put out a holding statement, and it turned out to be that they flipped the story right away. And he also mentioned that the University of Washington did a study about the spread of rumor online and how the rumor had a huge drop off as soon as the airline accounts started tweeting the corrections. Okay. There was another example shared by a Twitter user, Stacy Long. She mentioned, the viral and totally false rumors about Tommy Hilfiger announcing he was racist on Oprah. So it affected his brand for decades, and it literally never happened. And I barely remembered it, but I only remembered it as soon as she mentioned that. At Sarah Morgan mentioned to me when the FDA needed a crisis line to assure people that Pop Rocks would not make your stomach explode. That's another rumor. And then the old standby, Warren Weeks, one of my favorite media trainers. I've had him on the podcast a few times. He and I both talk about the same rumor a lot. Of course, Ellen, the rumor went out that she was not so nice, and it turned out to be true. And now her talk show is coming to an end. The third type of crisis, the data breach. When confidential or sensitive data is viewed, stolen, or held for ransom by unauthorized groups or people. Examples: the ransomware attack targeting Colonial Pipeline just a few weeks ago. It forced the closure of the major U.S. pipeline, and it caused the price and demand of fuel to skyrocket. In 2017, I'm sure you remember Equifax, one of the largest credit bureaus. They had a data breach. Do you remember I had talked about the social media app Parler? That was back in episode 108. I'll include the link in the show notes. But right after I did that podcast, a few weeks after that, all their data was scraped by a hacker because they were able to get into the Amazon Web Services, and they could find out all the user information. Also, a lot of local data breaches. I'm just mentioning, the big ones, but at a municipality level, small business level, there's phishing emails that happen all the time to hack into companies and in the public and private sector. All right, the next type of crisis. This is number 4. That's the unexpected loss of leadership. So this is when an organization suddenly loses a key leader, like a CEO, to illness. Or if a CEO has to step down, like in the case of Bill Gates, when he stepped down off the board. Now we know why. Another example, this one provided by Warren Weeks again. He mentioned Steve Jobs when he died of pancreatic cancer, of course, the head of Apple Computers. Sarah Morgan on Twitter mentioned Tony Hsieh. So he was the former chief executive of Zappos. He had stepped away from the job, but he had died in a fire in New London, Connecticut. So still the brand Zappos was attached to that death. Another example that I found online that was interesting, XTI Aircraft. So they were a startup in Inglewood, California, in Colorado. They had developed an experimental jet and this business was poised to take off. And the vice chairman, Jeff Pino, who's getting ready to launch the company, died in a plane crash 8 days before it was set to launch. All right, the 5th type of crisis. This is the social media fail or the faux pas that can end up on social media. So this is when a company or brand intentionally or unintendedly make a mistake, an oops or a fail. So some examples would be on International Women's Day this year, 2021, the Twitter account for Burger King UK tweeted, "Women belong in the kitchen." So the full context of the tweet was in a series of subsequent threaded tweets where they were explaining that there was a lack of female chefs in the restaurant business. However, the first tweet, Twitter was not amused. Twitter did not have the patience to go through the thread, and it turned out to be a huge social media fail. Another example that you may remember, fast food from a number of years ago. This was in 2017. McDonald's had a tweet that said Black Friday, and then it said need copy and link afterwards. Burger King at the time, the US Burger King, absolutely blasted McDonald's for that bad tweet, that social media fail. Another example, in February 2017, the Department of Education, they tweeted a post celebrating W.E.B. Du Bois. So it was a quote with his name. However, they misspelled his name. And then when they retweeted the apology, they misspelled the word apology. All right. And then there could be another example. It could be from racial tone. So in 2018, you may have remembered the retailer H&M, they got into hot water when they casted an African-American boy to have him model a hoodie with a message on the sweatshirt that said coolest monkey in the jungle. They rightfully received a lot of backlash for that tweet. All right, next. The 6th type of a crisis. I'm going to combine 2 of these together. Human error accidents or product harm, and then, of course, technical error accidents. The human type of accidents. So those were the errors that resulted in potentially dangerous circumstances. There could be a fatality. An example might be when people are killed in Tesla accidents. It could be police shootings. Okay, what happened in Minneapolis? We're coming up on the year anniversary of George Floyd. Also, the Brooklyn Center police officer is going to be charged with manslaughter. And now they're looking at murder when she thought she was using a taser and she ended up killing someone instead. So those would be human error accidents. Aligned with that would be adjacent to that would be technical error accidents. So think airplane crashes, think the Challenger explosion, think Samsung Galaxy when it exploded in people's pockets. So on a smaller scale, think about it at your company. What kind of accident could happen that could cause injury to a customer or to an employee? All right, next, the 7th type of crisis could be corporate culture crisis. This is a new and upcoming type of a crisis. Like 20 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily have this type of crisis, but nowadays, definitely. Some people at companies may dismiss this as woke culture, you never want to get in the trap of ever using the word woke or ever tolerating the word woke in any of those conversations when it comes to any type of crisis planning, crisis management, crisis mitigation, or day of when you are managing a crisis that is happening in real time. That's where companies have corporate culture problems. So examples might be Amazon's fight, the anti-union fight that they're dealing with. And even before all this, during the pandemic, they received a lot of bad press for how they were treating employees during the pandemic. Same with Kroger. That's the nation's largest grocery chain. They received a number of bad stories due to their treatment of employees during the pandemic. All right, next, the 8th type of a crisis would be stakeholder activism, another rising type of crisis for this time. That's when an organization is confronted, usually online, by angry, disconnected, or disenfranchised consumers, or members, or voters or town folks, whatever it is. The group, the organization, they're usually called out for behavior that's inappropriate or dishonest, or people feel it's unjust behavior. Stakeholder activism. I'll be spending a lot more time on this topic in the very near future. All right, next, the 9th type of crisis, think malevolence, think malice. Think of when extreme or problematic behavior impacts the reputation of a brand or business. Think Kevin Spacey. He was removed from the film All the Money in the World after he was accused of sexual misconduct. I mean, basically, he was wiped off, the map. He was completely canceled for that. More recent, Chrissy Teigen being dropped by Target, even though she says that she wasn't, that plan was in advance. I don't believe that. Macy's and recently Bloomingdale's. I guess Bloomingdale's was getting ready to sign her. I read this morning. They were getting ready to sign her. And then this whole blow up happened about how she was sending extremely cruel messages to other women on social media. She was within hours of signing a deal with Bloomingdale's. Boop. It ended because of her malicious behavior. All right, next, this is the 10th type of crisis. I kept it for the last one because this one hurts. But sadly, it's workplace violence. So unfortunately, nowadays, so much of this example comes from shootings. So think FedEx in Indiana. Think of there were employees in 2020 who were killed at the Molson Coors facility in Wisconsin. Also examples, just a few weeks ago in St. Cloud, Minnesota, there were 5 employees who were held hostage at a Wells Fargo bank. So any type of workplace violence that can happen. So there are many more, obviously, on that list, but it's something that everyone should plan for because you never know. That is the list of 10. Now, there are many more. If you were counting along with me, I'm sure you probably thought of many more on your own. Consider this just a sample plate, but it's a good list for you to start from when you're planning for a crisis. Here is my call to you. If you're a leader of a business, or if you're a communicator for a business, use this as an exercise. Create your top 10 list for the potential threats to your organization. Don't make them necessarily logical, the ones that you always know about. Go off of this list and see if your business can be impacted by any of them. Okay? There's number 1, the collateral crisis. Number 2, rumor. Number 3, a data breach. Number 4, unexpected loss of leadership. Do you have a succession plan in place? A 5th type, social media fail or the faux pas. Number 6, human error accidents, technical error accidents. The 7th, corporate culture crisis. The 8th type of crisis, stakeholder activism. The 9th type of crisis, any type of malicious behavior. And finally, number 10, the 10th type of crisis, workplace violence. So make sure that if you are someone responsible for putting a communication plan together, a crisis plan together, make sure you make a plan to plan for a crisis because you don't want your next crisis to go viral. That's all for this week on the podcast. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter at Molly McPherson and now on Facebook at Molly McPherson PR. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.